Morning. All right. Today we are going to be talking about, I should say good afternoon, shouldn't I? Today we're going to be talking about line, shape, color, and how we use that to create non-objective art. A couple weeks ago we talked about realistic art, how we drew things that were representational, and how we could abstract things. Last week we did an abstract work of art where we just did work on that abstraction, how we could make something that was representational. In other words, we could tell what the subject matter was. We could tell if we were drawing fruit or flowers or bees, but we did it in a very abstract, very different way. This week we're looking at non objective art, which means there's not going to be an object that we can recognize. There's going to be no object, no subject matter that we can see. And so, before we get going, we're going to first take a look at our module here. We're at page 20. We're kind of wrapping up this first module. And we're going to be looking at how artists create these very unique designs, very interesting designs. Sometimes they have a lot of energy. Sometimes they have a lot of emotion that we can display through them. But what they won't have is a subject matter. We won't look at it and go, oh, that's a boat on the ocean and that sort of thing. We won't see that. This is what we're talking about. Uh, some people may think it looks like scribbles. This is a Jackson Pollock, and Jackson Pollock was one of these artists who worked in a non-objective form. He didn't try to do landscapes or boats and that sort of thing. And I don't know about you all, but our canvas is not working very well today on my end. So I go to 21. All right. So first of all, when we're looking at non-objective art, patterns very often fall into this category. Patterns can be just random colors repeated over and over again, shapes that are repeated over and over again. When we have an element that is repeated, very often it creates a pattern. Pattern is when we have a repetition that is regular, so and repeated in the same way over and over again. And so little squares. If you look on the bottom left, that creates a pattern of little squares. Now, if some of the squares were giant and some of them were tiny, it probably wouldn't make a pattern. If we look over on the right, this is probably not really an example of a pattern. These are sort of random, what we call contour lines, lines that find the outside object of the outside edge of an object. You can look for patterns in the community around you. And again, if we look at this work of art, this is really neat. They're making great use of line. We see lots of diagonal lines creating these sort of like X's that go across. And then those X's create these little diamonds. We're looking at geometric shape. Remember, shape, that is something you might find in geometry class, like circles and squares and triangles. And in this case, diamonds. Those are geometric shapes, shapes that look like they've been made by man. And that repetition, repeating those diamond shapes, those geometric shapes, creates this unique pattern. The pattern is kind of emphasized and a lot of energy is created by using color. We see lots of warm colors like reds and yellows and oranges. Lots of cool colors like blues and greens, and even some of those purples are real cool. And so we're looking here again. What makes this non objective? Well, if we look at this work of art, we don't see a subject matter. And a subject matter again is what that painting's about. What's the object that we see in it? Um, if it's a portrait, if it was a portrait, we'd see the person's face. If it was a landscape, we would see recognizable things like trees or mountains or sky. None of that. This is non-objective. There's no subject matter being depicted. When we look at Kandinsky, he did these really cool works of art that focused on line and shape and a little bit color, but mostly these lines and shape and how he used line to create movement. Remember, movement's how our eye travels through a work of art. If we look at this work of art, our eye sort of travels around and we see these movements created, and as our eye follow those, that creates that movement. These are really neat. These make good use of that color, also cool shape, lots of line. And so that line begins to create some textures. We see what we call crosshatch lines. If you remember, we talked about line. If we have lines that go in one direction and the lines that cross back over them, sort of like tic-tac-toe pattern, that's called cross-hatching. So we see good use of cross-hatching there. We see organic shapes. Look at these cool shapes. Remember, organic shapes, those shapes we might find in nature, like clouds and rocks and stuff, and they're real weird edges. We see lots of those, but we also see some geometric shapes. We see some long rectangles here, squares and circles. Same thing over here. We've got this pattern created with this little grid, this little geometric sort of grid here. This is a square. That's a geometric shape. There's another square. But we also have these weird organic shapes and these really cool lines that create movement of our eye throughout the work of art. But again, no subject matter. Nothing identifiable. So now we're going to talk a little bit about what we're going to want to do on our Make Day this week. And let me go into my slideshow. And so we're looking at non-objective art. And this week we're going to create some non-objective art, art that doesn't have to look like anything in particular. And so if you are one of those students that says, "Oh, I can't draw," this is the perfect opportunity because you don't have to know how to draw to make something non-objective. And so non-objective art does not try to represent a specific subject, okay? It's going to focus on things like shape, color. Composition is how we arrange those things like shape and color and line and even texture, but how we put those together, that's the composition. So, what we want to look at this week, I want you to think about, is how you're going to create a beautiful work of art, something really neat, something that really gets eye movement, has some excitement, a focal point, something we want to look at, but not create something that we're going to recognize. This is harder than it sounds because we're just not used to working that way. When we sit down to draw, very often, inadvertently, we just naturally start to draw something we're familiar with, like a car or a shoe or a person, that sort of thing. That's not what we're trying to do this week. So let's take a look at some of these examples here so maybe you can get some ideas of what you're going to do in your design. So this is a work that focuses a lot on color. If we look at the background, we see this kind of bluish green, this red stripe, this yellow stripe, this blue purple sort of used at the bottom, and these yellows. Lots of line, creating lots of movement, zigzagging line, curving line, crosshatch lines, but lots of cool lines that create movement with our eye within that work of art, but no subject matter. These are two awesome works of art that focus on shape. So on the left, looking at geometric shapes, these are really cool, mostly triangles. We're looking at the color. We're seeing lots of use of that warm color, those reds, those oranges, those yellows. But we also have that big blue background, that field of blue, and a couple dark blue triangles there for emphasis. But if we consider why did that artist use those bright reds and yellows on that light blue background? Well, we think about that focal point. When we have contrast, remember contrast are two things that are very different, like an element. So in color, two contrasting colors might be warm color and cool color. They're very different than each other. They contrast with each other. So that red and orange and yellow on top of that light blue creates contrast, which makes our eyes really want to look at it. It creates a focal point, makes us want to look at those things. In the work on the right, the work on the right, we can see that there's also great use of geometric shape. But the artist has done some really interesting stuff where they've created some of these shapes almost as organic shapes. If we look in the bottom right-hand corner, there is this kind of weird blue shape. If we look sort of in the top left-hand corner, we see sort of these weird shapes that really aren't rectangles, they're not really circles, and so it makes the whole painting look a little softer. It's not so rigid where everything has to be so perfect. The colors are sort of muted and soft. We see light pinks, light blues, and so the way the artist has used color, the way they've used shape, has created sort of this emotional feeling or this feeling of calm, and that's kind of reinforced with those sort of soft edges around some of those shapes, and again, those soft colors. In these last two examples we're going to look at today, emphasis on the use of color and shape. And the work on the left, this is all about geometric shape. A big square with a white, the square is black, a white diamond in the middle of that, and then a circle inside that, and then circles inside the circles. Where those circles converge, they create more new circles. So we see the red and the black and the blue and the yellow, and each of those circles and those uses of color help create that movement within our eyes. We start to see figure eight start shapes going on, and that red swoop kind of brings our eye around like that, and that yellow almost becomes the focal point because it's the brightest thing, and then it's got a big splat of red right in the center of it. The work on the right also about geometric shape, but this one is what we call asymmetrical. If we look at the one on the left, we talk about balance. Symmetrical is if you divide something down the middle and it's pretty much the same on both sides, that's going to be symmetrical balance. This one, if we divide it down the middle, it's going to be a whole lot the same. The colors may be a little different, but the amount of what's going on each side is going to be very similar. If we divide this one down the middle on the right, it's very different. It uses asymmetrical balance, and so by doing so, our eyes do some crazy weird things with that asymmetrical balance. We look all over this crazy painting. The artist is also using those geometric shapes. They're using that line to direct our eye, and of course they're using color. We see that bright orange really becomes a focal point. It's where our eyes kind of want to look at, and we see lots of movement sort of towards that. Some of those lines kind of that green shape almost becomes an arrow that points to the orange. Those blue spaces almost become arrows that point sort of up towards that orange space. And so think about this week how you are going to create an original work of art that doesn't have a subject matter, looking at color, shape, how you can use the space of the canvas to create movement with our eyes, create a focal point, some type of cool thing we want to look at most. And I look forward to seeing what you guys are going to create later this week.